Hi again. Today's message is on the authenticity of the Bible and of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The New Testament is really all about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So when we talk about the authenticity of the Bible, we're talking about the authenticity of the message as well. And we're going to look at this from a scientific perspective. And remember, real science is observation and experimentation. Well, in this case, we can't experiment because this already happened 2,000 years ago. So we're going to observe and see what we can see, scientifically speaking, about the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the authenticity of the Bible. First of all, let's look at some quotes. Here's a few quotes of historians. First of all, E.M. Blaylock. I claim to be an historian. My approach to classics is historical, and I tell you that the evidence for life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history. That's E.M. Blaylock, professor of classics at Auckland University. Now, here's one from Clark Pinnock of McMaster University. There exists no document from the ancient world witnessed by so excellent a set of textual and historical testimonies. Skepticism regarding the historical credentials of Christianity is based upon an irrational bias. An irrational bias is why people want to prove the Bible to be not authentic. And then we have A.N. Sherwin. For the New Testament of Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. That's Anne Sherwin White, classical Roman historian. Now let's look at F.F. Bruce. F.F. Bruce is a professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the University of Manchester. If the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. If it were a secular writing, it would be regarded as authentic beyond all doubt. And then concerning the value of the New Testament records as primary sources, F.F. Bruce said, had there been any tendency to depart from the facts in any material respect, the possible presence of hostile witnesses in the audience would have served as a further corrective. The New Testament accounts for the resurrection were being circulated within the lifetimes of men and women alive at the time of the resurrection. Those people would certainly have confirmed or denied the accuracy of such accounts. The writers of the four Gospels had either had themselves been witnesses or else were relating the accounts of eyewitnesses of the actual events in advocating their case for the gospel, a word that means good news. The apostles appealed, even when confronting their most severe opponents, to common knowledge concerning the facts of the resurrection. In other words, it was common knowledge. So is the New Testament reliable? Because the New Testament provides the primary historical source for information on the resurrection, many critics during the 19th century attacked the reliability of these biblical documents. By the end of the 19th century, however, archaeological discoveries had confirmed the accuracy of the New Testament manuscripts. Discoveries of early papyri bridged the gap between the time of Christ and existing manuscripts from a later date. Those finding increased scholarly confidence in the reliability of the Bible. William F. Albright, who in his day was the world's foremost biblical archaeologist, said, "We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. 2 full generations before the date between 130 and 150 given by the more radical New Testament critics of today." The archaeologist William Albright said that he can emphatically say that there is no solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after AD 80. 80 AD. Okay? That's within the lifetimes of the people who wrote it. So that's very significant. Then coinciding with the papyri discoveries, an abundance of other manuscripts came to light, and over 24,000 copies of early New Testament manuscripts are known to be in existence today. 24,000. Okay, the historian Luke wrote of authentic evidence concerning the resurrection. That was back when Luke wrote it. Sir William Ramsay, who spent 15 years attempting to undermine Luke's credentials as a historian and to refute the reliability of the New Testament, finally concluded Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the greatest of historians, the very greatest of historians. In other words, this guy was trying to refute Luke's credentials and was trying to prove his accounts to be not authentic, and he couldn't do it. This was a guy who was trying to undermine Luke's credentials, and he could not do it. The New Testament witnesses were fully aware of the background against which the resurrection took place. The body of Jesus, in accordance with Jewish burial custom, was wrapped in a linen cloth. About 100 pounds of aromatic spices mixed together to form a gummy substance were applied to the wrappings of cloth about the body. In other words, he was kind of wrapped like a mummy. After the body was placed in a solid rock tomb, an extremely large stone was rolled against the entrance of the tomb. Large stones weighing approximately 2 tons were normally rolled by means of levers against a tomb entrance. A Roman guard was stationed to guard the tomb. That was at the Jews' request, the Jewish leaders. And they affixed on the tomb the Roman seal, which was meant to prevent any attempt at vandalizing the sepulchre. Anyone trying to move the stone from the tomb's entrance would have broken the seal and incurred the wrath of Roman law. But 3 days later, the tomb was empty. The followers of Jesus said he had risen from the dead. They reported that he appeared to them during a period of 40 days, showing himself to them by many infallible proofs. This is Acts 1, 1-3. This is Luke writing. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. After his suffering, he showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. And remember, Luke's authenticity as a historian is not even questioned by those who try to delegitimize him, try to say he was not legitimate. They could not do it. He is an absolute historian of the greatest note. The Apostle Paul recounted that Jesus appeared to more than 500 of his followers at one time, the majority of whom were still alive and could confirm what Paul wrote. This is very significant. 1 Corinthians 15, 3-9. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep or died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. Now remember, Paul persecuted the church of God. He was not a friend or follower of Jesus. Jesus appeared to him when he was persecuting the church of Jesus, and he became the author of half of the New Testament. So many security precautions were taken with the trial, crucifixion, burial, entombment, sealing, and guarding of Christ's tomb that it becomes very difficult for critics to defend their position that Christ did not rise from the dead. Consider these facts. Facts number 1, broken Roman seal. As we have said, the first obvious fact was the breaking of the seal that stood for the power and authority of the Roman Empire. The consequences of breaking the seal were extremely severe. the man or men who were responsible were apprehended, it meant automatic execution by crucifixion upside down. People feared the breaking of the Roman seal for obvious reasons. Fact number 2, the empty tomb. The disciples of Christ did not go off to Athens or Rome to preach that Christ was raised from the dead. Rather, they went right back to the city of Jerusalem, where if what they were teaching was false, the falsity would have been evident. The empty tomb was too notorious to be denied. Paul Althus states that the resurrection could have not been maintained in Jerusalem for a single day, for a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. Both Jewish and Roman sources and traditions admit an empty tomb. Those resources range from Josephus to a compilation of 5th century Jewish writings called the Toledoth Jeshu. Dr. Paul Meyer calls this positive evidence from a hostile source, which is the strongest kind of historical evidence. In essence, this means that if a source admits a fact decidedly not in its favor, then the fact is genuine. Gamaliel, who was a member of the Jewish High Court, suggested that the rise of Christianity could be God's doing. He would not have said that if the tomb were still occupied, or if the Sanhedrin knew the whereabouts of Christ's body. Paul Meyer observes that if all the evidence is weighed carefully according to the canons of historical research, the sepulchre of Joseph of Arimathea in which Jesus was buried was actually empty on the morning of the first Easter. No shred of evidence has been discovered to disprove it. Fact number 3, the large stone moved. On that Sunday morning, the first thing that impressed the people who approached the tomb was the unusual position of the 1.5 to 2 ton stone that had been lodged in front of the doorway. All the gospel writers mention it. Those who observed the stone after the resurrection described its position as having been rolled up a slope away, not just from the entrance of the tomb, but from the entire massive sepulchre. It was in such a position that it looked as if it had been picked up and carried away. Now I ask you, if the disciples had wanted to come in, tiptoe around the sleeping guards, and then roll the stone over and steal Jesus' body, how could they have done that without the guards' awareness? Fact number 4, the Roman guard goes AWOL. The Roman guards fled. They left their place of responsibility. How can their attrition be explained when Roman military discipline was so exceptional? Justin in Digest number 49 mentions all the offenses that required the death penalty. The fear of their superiors' wrath meant that they paid close attention to every detail of their jobs. One way a guard was put to death was by being stripped of his clothes and burned alive in a fire started with his garments. If it was not apparent which soldier had failed in his duty, then lots were drawn to see which one would be punished with death for the guard unit's failure. The entire unit would not have fallen asleep with that kind of threat over their heads. Dr. George Curry, a student of Roman military discipline, wrote that fear of punishment produced flawless attention to duty, especially in the night watches. Fact number 5, the linen grave clothes. In a literal sense, against all statements to the contrary, the tomb was not totally empty because of an amazing phenomenon. John, a disciple of Jesus, looked over to the place where the body of Jesus had lain, and there were the grave clothes in the form of the body, but empty. That's enough to make a believer out of anybody. The first thing that stuck in the minds of the disciples was not the empty tomb, but rather the empty grave clothes. Because he was wrapped. Jesus was wrapped like a mummy, according to Jewish burial customs. And the wrappings were there, and Jesus' body was gone. Fact number 6, Jesus' appearances were confirmed. When studying an event in history, it is important to know whether enough people who were participants or eyewitnesses to the event were alive when the facts about the event were published. To know this is obviously helpful in telling the accuracy of the published report. If the number of eyewitnesses is substantial, the event can be regarded as well established. For instance, if we all witness a murder and a later police report turns out to be a fabrication of lies, we as eyewitness can refute it. Several very important factors are often overlooked when considering Christ's post-resurrection appearances to individuals. The first is the large number of witnesses of Christ after the resurrection morning. One of the earliest records of Christ's appearing after the resurrection is by Paul. The apostle appealed to his audience's knowledge of the fact that Christ had been seen by more than 500 people at one time. Paul reminded them that the majority of those people were still alive and could be questioned. Dr. Edwin Yamauchi, associate professor of history at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, emphasizes what gives a special authority to the list of witnesses as historical evidence is the reference to most of the 500 brethren being still alive. Paul says, in effect, if you do not believe me, you can ask them. Such a statement in an admittedly genuine letter written within 30 years of the event is almost as strong evidence as one could hope to get for something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. Let's take the more than 500 witnesses who saw Jesus alive after his death and burial and place them in a courtroom. Do you realize that if each of those 500 people were to testify for only 6 minutes, including cross-examination, you would have an amazing 50 hours of first-hand testimony. The testimony of that many eyewitnesses would give you the largest and most lopsided trial in history. Another crucial factor is that Jesus also appeared to those who were hostile or unconvinced. People always comment that Jesus was seen alive after his death and burial only by his friends and followers. Using that argument, they attempt to water down the overwhelming impact of the multiple eyewitness accounts. But the line of reasoning is so pathetic, it hardly deserves comment. No author or informed individual would regard Saul of Tarsus as being a follower of Christ. The facts show the exact opposite. Saul despised Christ and persecuted Christ's followers. It was a life-shattering experience when Christ appeared to him. He was definitely not a friend or follower, yet he later became known as the Apostle Paul, one of the greatest witnesses of the truth of the resurrection. The argument that Christ's appearances were only to friends and followers is an argument made entirely by assumption, from lack of knowledge. It is equally possible that most to whom Christ appeared became followers after he appeared to them. We're talking 500 people, not 12. Fact number 7, lack of alternate possibilities. Christians believe that Jesus was bodily resurrected from the dead by the supernatural power of God. That may seem hard for some to believe, but it's actually harder not to believe it. The theories used by doubters to explain away the resurrection are so weak that they actually help prove the truth of the resurrection. A theory propounded by Kersop Lake assumes that the women who reported the body missing had mistakenly gone to the wrong tomb. That is, of course, impossible since they saw Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea lay the body in the tomb when it was originally laid there. Not to mention the fact that the guards were certainly guarding the right tomb, and they were there. If the resurrection claim was merely because of a geographical mistake, the Jewish authorities would have lost no time in producing the body from the proper tomb, thus effectively quenching for all time any rumor of resurrection. Another attempted explanation claims that the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection were either illusions or hallucinations. Unsupported by the psychological principles governing the appearances of hallucinations, this theory also does not coincide with the historical situation. Again, where was the actual body and why wasn't it produced? Another theory, popularized by Venturini several centuries ago, is often quoted today. This is the swoon theory, which says that Jesus didn't die. He merely fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. Everyone thought him dead, but later he resuscitated and the disciples thought it to be a resurrection. Skeptic David Frederick Strugler, not a believer in the resurrection, gives the death blow to any thought that Jesus revived from a swoon. It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at least yielded to his sufferings, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of their future ministry. In other words, there's no way that if he would have come crawling out of the grave, he would have appeared in the manners that he did appear. We know he appeared in perfect health, and he actually appeared going through a wall. He actually appeared to the disciples on the day he rose from the dead by appearing in a room that was locked. How did he do that? Then consider the theory that the body was stolen by the disciples while the guards slept. How would they have gotten Jesus' body out of the wrappings while still leaving the wrappings intact? Why not just take the wrapped body? The theory that the Jewish or Roman authorities moved Christ's body is no more reasonable an explanation for the empty tomb than theft by the disciples. If the authorities had the body in their possession or knew where it was, why, when the disciples were preaching the resurrection in Jerusalem, didn't they explain, wait, we moved the body. See, he didn't rise from the grave. Why didn't they explain exactly where Jesus' body lay? Why didn't they recover the corpse, put it on a cart, and wheel it through the center of Jerusalem? Such an action would have destroyed Christianity immediately. Professor Thomas Arnold, for 14 years a headmaster of rugby, author of the famous History of Rome, and appointed as the chair of modern history at Oxford, was well acquainted with the value of evidence in determining historical facts. This great scholar said, "I have been used for many years to study the histories of other times, and to examine and weigh the evidence of those who have written about them. And I know of no one fact in history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort to the understanding of a fair inquirer than the great sign which God has given us, that Christ died and rose again from the dead." Brooke Foss Westcott, an English scholar, said, taking all the evidence together, it is not too much to say that there is no historic incident better or more variously supported than the resurrection of Christ. Nothing but the antecedent assumption that it must be false could have suggested the idea of deficiency in the proof of it. Finally, fact number 8, the lives of the early Christians. But the most telling testimony of all must be the lives of those early Christians. We must ask ourselves, what caused them to go everywhere telling the message of the risen Christ? Did they receive any social status or material benefits from their wholehearted allegiance to the risen Christ? As a reward for their efforts, those early Christians were beaten, stoned to death, thrown to the lions, tortured, and crucified. In some cases, crucified upside down. Every conceivable method was used to stop them from talking, yet they laid down their lives as the ultimate proof of their confidence in the truth of their message. Now, from a scientific perspective, looking at all these facts, there is no possibility that Jesus did not rise from the dead. There's no alternate story that works. There's too many eyewitness accounts, and there's just too many facts that cause it to be unquestioned fact. The resurrection of Jesus Christ happened. Jesus died and rose again. Josephus even knew about it, who was not a Christian, and wrote about it. It's only modern day skepticism that it causes people to question the authenticity of Jesus' death and resurrection. The Bible is the most authenticated book in existence, and to this day, you can't find any document that has more authentication for it. So scientifically speaking, from a scientific perspective, you'd have to say that Jesus rose from the dead and that the Bible is authentic. I took a lot of these facts from various books on apologetics and different authors. There's a lot more evidence than this. I'm just giving you the very basic evidence. You can read a lot of books about apologetics, and they will tell you the absolutely inescapable truth that Jesus died and rose from the dead. It's just a fact. And people that don't believe it because they don't want to believe it. And mainly because the mainstream media and the mainstream narrative is that Jesus that the Bible's false and it's a book of fairy tales, that Jesus did not live, that Jesus did not die and rise again. And that's all based on propaganda, false information. Just like the Nazis in Germany brainwashed their people, the same way our America today and our world today is being brainwashed by propaganda. The truth is Jesus lived, he died on the cross, and he rose again. Thanks for watching.